All right, so I am going to go ahead and get this last lecture recorded. We're going to be talking about, well, it actually may not be the last, or maybe one more after this. We're going to be talking about the new identity and the activity that we've done in class with the Constitution. And the discussion board that we talked about connected the fact that the colonial legislatures believed that they should have independent power, right? This was the essence of their argument against Parliament and actual representation. And so we certainly see that the Articles of Confederation reflect that, and that they tried for a while to allow power to reside with the states, except it leads to a gigantic mess, right? And you have essentially this new United States is about to fall apart, so they have to go back to the drawing board. They do have some degree of trust in the common man. Some of you did a pretty good job of highlighting that. Some of you not so much. I would argue that they really didn't trust the common man, and that you can see by the men who were involved. You can see by the fact that they were throwing out this idea of direct, actual representation. Indicates that they didn't really trust the common man. But a few of you did kind of connect the fact that they did send delegates, and that these delegates do preserve some degree of representation. And you certainly see that that's kind of the case. At the end of the day, though, what you have is a strong central government that is created, and the strong central government is intended to really check the power of the states and to really create kind of this national unity, and have basically the United States act like a country. And so, kind of the tagline here is that, managing a nation is a far different cry than giving birth to one. Right? Having a revolution sounds great, but when you actually start trying to run a country, it's a whole different thing. We certainly see this this principle happens with ISIS right now, where ISIS is attempting to create this caliphate, and yet all they really have in place is how to fight people and how to kill people without any kind of system of creating a government. So I think that you can certainly see that the United States struggled with that same, okay, now that we actually have to run this thing, we actually have to make it work. And I think it is a strength of the Founding Fathers and of these men that they realized that they needed to go back to the drawing board. And you do see that they preserve some element of choice and trust. I just happen to think they dilute that quite a bit in relation to the idea of representation. And you can see very clearly, you can read for yourself who was in charge of what. Notice that Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, very fascinating individual, creates the system of the economy as we know it, the idea of a national bank, the idea of a well-managed debt, which is kind of a fascinating notion. And your parents, when they buy a house, right? A house is a debt that's well managed, right? That's going to retain value. The problem comes in if you have too much debt, and you have debt that's credit card bills from outfits that you've thrown away, or food that you've already eaten, or something like that. So there's, Hamilton kind of proposes this idea, and we'll go into some more detail with that later. Secretary of State Jefferson, we see that George Washington creates a cabinet. This is something that subsequent presidents will do. Noticeably, a largely undefined judiciary. That's going to come in. You will have the Judiciary Act of 1789. But that is not the end of the story for the Supreme Court. There's more that will happen with that after the election of 1800. So the Supreme Court, when George Washington and John Adams are president, is not the Supreme Court that we have today. It will change. Notice that John Adams, I put on here that he's irrelevant. He's really kind of the beginning of the irrelevant vice president. Very frustrating position for John Adams. He did not like being irrelevant. Matter of fact, he was incredibly jealous of Jefferson and Hamilton and the amount of power that they had over Washington. Of course, Hamilton had been the aide-de-camp for Washington during the Revolution, and of course, Washington certainly respected Jefferson's opinions very well. I don't think he disliked Adams, but very clearly he didn't turn to Adams the way that Adams would have liked. So just kind of a little bit of interesting side note there. So Alexander Hamilton, this is an interesting guy who comes from what is essentially the Caribbean, right? He was an illegitimate child. There's actually a play on Broadway right now, and maybe if somebody reminds me in class, I'll show you the Alexander Hamilton rap. Anyways, this play on Broadway kind of depicts, and it kind of pairs Alexander's life story with rap music. The idea being that Alexander Hamilton is the original gangster. That you have him coming from the Caribbean, taking advantage of this opportunity to be educated at Columbia University. He's Columbia University's most famous graduate, and he kind of comes from nothing. And because he's very intelligent, because he's able to write, and because he's a brilliant thinker, he's able to be successful. Now, the thing about Alexander Hamilton is that he learns his skills, I guess you could say, by managing these sugar manufacturers and kind of being like he runs like an import-export. He doesn't run it. He doesn't like own it in the sense that he's the one, but rather he is kind of like the clerk for it. So he manages like all this money and this debt and this kind of this macroeconomic level that we talked about in class with the planters and their relationship with the bankers. So he definitely kind of sees that. Notice that I put on here, he doesn't believe that owning land somehow makes you more virtuous. In fact, he would be one of those guys that would have looked at the common man and said, yeah, most of these guys don't have a clue what's going on. And so while he is all for democracy, he's all for republicanism and representation, absolutely. He believes that only those who are invested in the success of a country, i.e. those who own property, are the ones who should really have a stake. That ordinary people that don't own very much property or those who don't own any really don't have much to complain about, and they just need to sit down and need to work on owning stuff, right? So he's very much about the banking system. He's very much about property ownership. Loves the manufacturing system. This is a guy from New York, married into kind of a wealthy merchant family. He believed in the power of manufacturing, and so he's really creates this economic system that is tied to capitalism. He is the one that takes that, and remember, he's coming up with this notion before Adam Smith has written The Wealth of Nations, before we have these ideas about capitalism, and certainly the outcome from that, which is socialism, right? So he's talking about this before anyone's really even conceived of this notion. So Alexander Hamilton, with his ideas about a bank and financing debt, and that debt that is well managed, debt that is worth something. This is one interesting thing. We have a deficit now in our country, and the issue with the deficit now is that a lot of it's based on military expenditures. Well, except these are military expenditures. These are planes, these are tanks, these are guns, these are food that we fed the military that don't show up for anything, right? They're not worth anything now. They're destroyed or they've been digested or whatever. And so debt that is not well managed, debt that doesn't tie back to something is not valuable. But a country that spends its money on infrastructure, on economic growth, those things are well managed debt. Now, we still can argue back and forth about the role of debt, but the idea is that Alexander Hamilton comes up with this notion for the new United States. It's really groundbreaking. He is really an innovator in the sense of economics. And so he totally believes that we need a strong banking system, that we need wealthy individuals to be tied to the success of the country, that if the wealthy individuals feel vulnerable, that the country is going to be less successful. And we certainly see that, right? You also see him taking this idea of securing credit, this idea of the bonds that we talked about, this assumption of debt that we saw in Article 4 of the Constitution. This goes back to Alexander Hamilton. He believed that the United States had to develop a credit rating. We had to prove that when we issued money, when we issued bonds, that we were good for our word, and that if we couldn't do that, we weren't worth being a country. And so basically, it's his argument that this is why we need to have, we need to honor our debts. We need to honor those continental scripts and that kind of thing. And he believes that we should assume that debt. Now, if you think about the list of people who owned bonds, you can see that he's also kind of getting those, key people invested in the success of the country. So it's not like a complete populist idea. But this is really where it starts. And so I think there's a whole lot of interesting stuff going on here, and I've just thrown a ton of terms at you about Alexander Hamilton. That probably you're thinking none of this makes any sense to me whatsoever. But what I'm referring to is the idea that we had soldiers that were paid in Continental script. And so while he's talking about assuming those debts, remember that by the time he's doing this, many of these guys have sold their Continental script to banks and to brokers and to these speculators for a fraction of their value. So it's these wealthy individuals that were involved in the writing of the Constitution that are actually going to benefit from the system now. So hopefully maybe that clarified it a little bit for you. So yes, I am a Hamilton fan. I can't believe they want to take him off the $20 bill. I think that is ridiculous. He is absolutely the father of the economy. If they want to take somebody off, they should take Andrew Jackson off. Anyways, moving on. We'll talk about Andrew Jackson here in another week or two. You have the emergence of the Democrat Republicans. Now, we begin to see political parties developing. Now, these are not the Democrat Republicans, I suppose, in a very vague sense, are connected with the Democrats of today, but it's very vague and it's very loose, and it's almost like second cousin 5 times removed. I mean, it's not a super close connection, although you can kind of draw something of a family tree. The Democrat Republicans are represented by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. James Madison, who, yes, is the father of the Constitution. He believed in a strong central government, but he disagreed with Alexander Hamilton and the role of the bank. He didn't believe that we wanted to have a national bank because to him that looked an awful lot like what England had in the Bank of England. So it's this economic thing that's really going to fracture and create political parties, and I think that's a very incredible notion. I mean, we talked about Federalists and Anti-Federalists being kind of tied to, what is the role of the federal government? Do we want this Constitution? What about the Bill of Rights? Once you pass the Bill of Rights, though, the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist issue kind of goes away. The difference is the Federalists will continue to emerge as being exampled by Alexander Hamilton and this idea about economic expansion and banks and well-managed debts and all this kind of stuff, whereas the Anti-Federalists, who aren't really talking about federal government anymore, they're going to transition into what are called the Democrat Republicans, which are against the banking system. They're against the Bank of the United States assuming the debts and basically creating its own, like starting off in debt, right? And their big argument is that the Constitution does not specify the Bank of the United States. Therefore, Congress cannot create the Bank of the United States, also known as the BUS. This is the first BUS we're talking about. There will actually be 2 banks of the United States before it's done away with, thanks to Andrew Jackson. But so BUS 1, this is a major issue for the Democrat Republicans. And we see that this assumption of debts, this idea of buying back the bonds. So it's not just a matter of the federal government buying back the bonds and paying for the Continental script. It's the fact that the Bank of the United States is going to finance that. And so the Democrat Republicans don't really have a clear economic plan, and I think that tells us a whole lot about the Democrat Republicans and kind of what some of their weaknesses were in a lot of ways. Of course, the Democrat Republicans believe in the idea of the agrarian ideal, these small yeoman farmers, working really hard and having Republican ownership, that kind of, state legislature, actual representation notion is what the Democrat Republicans believed in. But as we've talked about in class, right, in practice, those yeoman farmers typically had a much harder time making it financially. And obviously this kind of representation that they're thinking of isn't always a nice, neat process. And sometimes these guys and their agendas don't always fit with running what is a solid country. So we have this kind of disconnect between what the ordinary citizen wants and what's best for everyone. So I think it's very important to kind of understand that. So Hamilton's economic plan. First off, he issues a report on manufacturers, basically illustrates, hey, the manufacturing sector is beginning to grow. We need to encourage this. We need to do what we can to make it better, and we can do this by establishing the Bank of the United States. And this is his big plan, that this will allow businesses then to borrow money so they can grow their business and manufacture more goods, and that the United States will then be able to trade with other countries, and that you'll have this growth in the manufacturing sector at the same time as you have agricultural growth. We see that he proposes an excise tax on whiskey as a way of raising money to help make the debt payments that they're making. And he has a little bit of a limited tariff. He doesn't want to restrict markets too much. Tariffs, remember, are taxes on imported goods. Tariffs protect domestic manufacturing. He wants to protect domestic manufacturing a little bit, but he doesn't want to do so at the expense of shutting off all foreign markets, because if we're going to have businesses borrowing money to grow their business, then they have to be able to rely on markets to sell their stuff. So his notion is this limited tariff will have an excise tax on whiskey. Now, what's going to happen with the whiskey is that farmers along the frontier, those in the Ohio River Valley, those closer to the Mississippi River, say, than closer to the coastline, a lot of times they're going to rely on distilling their corn into whiskey, distilling their rye into these whiskey products. And this is this is an easier way for them to transport. Plus, alcohol's wildly popular in the United States, has always been wildly popular. And so you're going to have people that represent those yeoman farmers, those small farmers, are going to resent the whiskey tax. They're going to say, oh, this is clearly big business taking advantage of this. These are these speculators in the bonds. These are the bankers. These are that group of people, and they're taking advantage of the system, so we need to do something about it. And so this is what we're going to see splintering what is the Federalists, right? And so anybody who had supported the Constitution are now going to be divided over the role of the bank and what kind of economy we want to have. Hamilton's key plan is that the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution, which is the one that basically says that Congress can do what is necessary and proper for the running of the country, allows them to charter the Bank of the United States. And he promotes this idea of what we call implied powers, that Congress has implied powers within the Constitution, that just like individuals don't have to have every single right spelled out in the Constitution, and just like states don't have to have every responsibility spelled out in the Constitution, Congress doesn't have to have everything spelled out in the Constitution, that Congress is allowed to look at the country, look at the way things are running, they want to make sure that it's in alignment with what the Constitution says, but it doesn't have to be explicitly stated. This is a loose construction of the Constitution, as opposed to a strict construction. Republicans are going to want a strict construction of the Constitution because they're going to want it to be only what's specified in the Constitution. Remember, these are people that would have been made up of the anti-federalists that then switched sides because they liked the Bill of Rights. They want everything to be nicely spelled out. Think back to the colonial legislatures, right? We want a written constitution. So the idea that you would have a constitution that can be stretched and pulled and you can have implied things in it, that makes them very uncomfortable because to them that's a little bit too much like Great Britain. So essentially you have kind of this division going on over the role of the economy and the Bank of the United States. And Madison and Jefferson essentially decide that, hey, we will support Hamilton's plan if he will argue that the nation's capital will be located in the South. Their idea being that agricultural interests, Southern interests, slave interests, will be better served if the capital is close to where those interests are. Remember this idea that you have to have a connection with people and understand what they're dealing with in order to really have an idea of what's going on. So we see that, that they will support that, and this is really done largely over kind of a backroom deal. Remember that Hamilton has a working relationship with these guys. Hamilton and Madison had written the Federalist Papers together. Madison and Jefferson were the go-to guys for Washington, so they have a working relationship, and they essentially sit down and come up with this notion that if we station the capital in the South, close to agricultural and slave interests, that those interests will have sway over the national government, and that the people represented by Hamilton will be happy because they get this Bank of the United States and the assumption and all that kind of stuff that they want. Now, what we see is that this this kind of decision begins to align the country in two different camps. We've got the agrarian camp, the agricultural camp, those who care about, agricultural products and the labor that's needed and the things that are needed for that, which, initially is all about slavery, but then later on will have to do with some things like tariffs and, and how tariffs influence agriculture. But then you're also going to have the urban idea, the fact that urban areas are based on manufacturing and banking interests, and that those things kind of take over. Okay, why is that? There we go. You have some frontier challenges. You have the kind of in the Ohio-Indiana territory that all the movement into that valley puts pressure on the Indian groups there, and so they kind of react and push back. And they kind of start to argue for that pan-Indian. If you think back to when we talked about the Neolin and Pontiac and that kind of thing, well, you have a similar situation with Chief Little Turtle. Of course, unfortunately, it's not enough. Spanish control of New Orleans is going to create some shipping problems, which you've already kind of addressed. And the Whiskey Rebellion. Pennsylvania farmers resist taxation, and they basically go on the march. But what will happen is that the U.S. government will react to protect white settlers without regard to their own legislation with the Indian Intercourse Act of 1790 that essentially said that Indian groups were like countries within a country, so to speak. So basically dismiss that in favor of the settlers. The Mississippi Valley and control of New Orleans becomes a very desired thing from the United States. And George Washington leads a military response against the Whiskey Rebellion and basically puts it down. And it signals to people that, it's one thing to have freedom to assemble and freedom of speech, but you can't get a bunch of guns and march on the state capitol. I know there's been some NRA protests that look a little bit like that. But very clearly the Whiskey Rebellion means that we're not going to do that. That dissent is fine, that you can question your government, you can speak out against your government, but you cannot take a mob and you cannot march on the centers of government and try to tear them down. That's just not acceptable. And so we have this idea of the United States really kind of acting like a nation. Many of these Indian tribes that live in the West are really struggling with how to respond. You start to see, in the beginning, at the end of the 1700s, early 1800s, a little more interest in Christianizing Indians. That becomes more of a thing than what we saw in the colonial period. And really, the United States, the biggest problem is that while they, on the surface, say, oh, we're going to make treaties, we're going to treaty with these groups, we're going to treat them like nations within a nation, at the end of the day, they yield to Western expansion and making Western territory more available. And, the nuances, the fairness, the, fulfilling of treaty obligations is not a big concern for the United States government. And we'll see that really this kind of dismissal of Indian rights, Indian claims, goes back to this period of the 1790s. You're going to see that many Indian groups, we've already talked about the Iroquois some, they focus a lot on coexistence. They manage to kind of still survive in these areas around the Great Lakes region, despite the fact that the United States is the main power. Of course, initially, until we get to the War of 1812, some of these Indian groups managed to play the British off of the Americans a little bit, emphasis on a little bit, but that will go away completely once the War of 1812 is over. And you still have the same notion of the American government, which is, yeah, we like the theory of Indian claims and Indian rights and treaties and upholding our end, but in practice we don't want it to interfere with Western expansion and keeping a bunch of yeoman farmers happy and keeping land speculators happy. The Cherokee, which will be in Georgia, which we'll be talking about, they will end up facing what is largely assimilation. The initial wave that they face in Georgia, as people start spilling westward after the revolution's over, is they very quickly begin to adopt white ways. They own slaves. They try to, grow sugar and then later cotton. You see that they develop their own written language. They have their own systems of government. Now, the problem is they're trying to make these assimilations, and it's still not enough for white American society. They still don't treat them as equal. They don't view them as a nation within a nation. So they're not perceived as being significant at all. And so this is one of the problems, but I do think it's telling to notice that the Cherokee did try assimilation. When we talk about the Trail of Tears and Andrew Jackson, you'll see that this assimilation does nothing for them. It doesn't help them at all. The Shawnee, who are also kind of in that kind of southern kind of Gulf Coast region around what is now Mississippi, Georgia, kind of Florida, that area, as well as the Creek, they attempt to resist. The Shawnee become very good at hit and run. They attempt to resist. The Creek almost face annihilation by the time you get to the 1830s. And so there's a lot of interesting different ways that these Indian groups try to respond. International tensions, you're going to see that the French Revolution basically explodes in Europe, and you're going to have, but with the Republic of France becomes territorially aggressive. One of the things we'll talk about when we talk about nationalism is that an easy way for new countries to kind of develop a sense of team spirit, if you will, is to start attacking people. One could argue that the United States doesn't quite do that, although maybe if you perceive the Indian groups, that maybe that was a form of nationalism for the United States, possibly. So the French Revolution is going to trigger a conflict in Europe where Great Britain is upset over what happened with King Louis and the fact they cut off his head and the French Republic, and so you're going to have war breaking out. And George Washington keeps saying, we're going to be neutral. We're going to be neutral. We're not going to get involved. We're not going to choose sides. We're not going to get into entangling relationships. And what we'll see is that American ships will begin to be seized by Great Britain. And they'll start impressing American soldiers because Great Britain still views the United States as kind of like its little brother, right? Even though technically it's independent. Yeah, sure, you moved out of the house, but I'm going to get to tell you what to do all the time. And so the Jay Treaty will actually attempt to resolve this tension with Great Britain. It doesn't really achieve much else, and it's largely unpopular, and it doesn't really change Britain's behavior much at all. Now, the difference is that Pinckney's treaty will negotiate with Spain over New Orleans. We will begin to get some territory in Florida, and so they'll pass these two treaties together in order to get support, because everybody's going to want New Orleans and the Mississippi River Valley, and everybody's going to want Florida. And they're not getting all of Florida, but they're getting a portion of it. And remember, the Spanish had enticed slaves to run away to Florida, which will continue. It doesn't go away yet. But they like the idea of having more of a buffer zone with Florida. So I wanted to kind of point out that you've got international situations. You've got the United States attempting to act like its own country, except that, it's with mixed results. Obviously, Pinckney's treaty is successful, but Jay's treaty with Great Britain is far less so. And so you're going to see that a lot of this speaks to the fact that our relationship with Great Britain, due to the economic nature, the trade, the assumption of debts, those kind of things make our working with Great Britain incredibly, incredibly important. The United States has this brand new manufacturing sector. We're not ready to be on our own yet. Britain is way far ahead of us when you're talking about manufacturing and that kind of thing. So we're the kind of beggars with hat in hand going to Great Britain. So we kind of take what they give us and say, thank you, sir, may I have another. But we do have that Western expansion is encouraged. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about the XYZ affair because that really has a whole lot more to do with kind of the situation in France and the post-war of 1812. But I do want you to see that we begin to have political parties. And the political parties are not just divided over the role of the economy and the role of banks, but they're also divided over influence of Britain, the influence of France, who are we going to be more friendly with, what relationship matters more. Remember, we have a treaty of alliance and friendship with France. Of course, that was with the monarchy of France, and of course, it's, Louis gets his head cut off. But then we also have these business ties with Great Britain, and clearly the United States has a degree of favoritism towards Great Britain. So it's kind of interesting, right? We don't know. These political parties start to shape up over these issues about finance and over these issues over international relations. That's why we take a second to kind of be aware of what's going on internationally, because if we aren't, then we don't understand where these political parties are coming from, what some of their key issues are. Notice that Hamilton, of course, argues a lot for neutrality, for not upsetting the British, because remember, I mean, this is a guy from the Caribbean. The Caribbean was very controlled by Great Britain. He was always a patriot. But he definitely had some leanings with kind of loyalists and the Tories and those kind of people. And you see that in his influence with George Washington. And you also see the influence of his relationship with George Washington. Thomas Jefferson resigns. He's very pro-French because, of course, the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. All of this sounds a whole lot like what the French are doing during the French Revolution. And so, yes, he's going to support the French. And so this is one of the first issues that begins to divide the parties. Now, that will not be everything about the political parties. There's more to it than that. But this is really where the rupture starts to happen. Of course, this was after they had kind of reached terms over the role, the Capitol building and the Bank of the United States and the assumption of debts. So you kind of had a little bit, some cracks showing up with that. Then they kind of patch it over. And then you have this issue with France and war in Europe, and who are we going to have the best relationship with? And that's where it really just kind of shatters the foundation. And you have the creation of political parties. The Federalists, you can kind of see this here. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. But notice that they tend to look at the common man kind of like, well, can we really trust him? These are going to be the guys that would have said, oh, yeah, we need the Electoral College. We want to make sure local politics stay local, that national issues are national. The Democratic Republicans are going to trust in the common man. Yes, these informed masses, these people that are educated and involved and all this kind of stuff, and that we can trust people with the vote, which is kind of an interesting notion, right? Can we truly trust people? And the Democrat Republicans say that we can. The Federalists, of course, believe in that loose interpretation of the Constitution. We can, we can interpret what the Constitution might mean, whereas the Democrat Republicans are going to say, no, we want the strict Constitution, strict interpretation, because only what's specified in the Constitution can be applied to the government. And so this is kind of, this idea we want a strong enough central government to have national unity, but we don't want one that is so strong that we have to worry about individual liberties. Of course, you can see here this idea of business and manufacturing and tariffs for the Federalists. You can see that the Democrat Republicans prefer agriculture. They're not really about special protection for manufacturing. They're not opposed to manufacturing, but they don't think it deserves any special protection. And, of course, obviously this pro-French, pro-British attitude. This idea of the national debt in banking. Democrat Republicans would be, oh, we don't want a national debt at all. Once we pay off these bonds and the Continentals, we need to not have any debt, right? We need to not worry about infrastructure spending. We need to let the states finance their own improvements. Keep everything at the state and the local level. Whereas the Federalists are going to argue, no, investing in infrastructure, in canals and railroads, in roads. These things help business. They help farmers. They help everybody. And this will grow our country and grow our economy. Okay, sure, it does lead to some debt. But a strong national government is going to be able to handle that debt, and it's going to make the nation overall stronger. And this is why we need a powerful central bank. We need a central bank that can provide stability. That a bunch of individual state banks, 13, 15, 20 state banks, are going to be subject to all these different whims. They've got to work with each other. They've got to coordinate. And it just creates more of an atmosphere of instability, whereas a strong central bank is going to control everything. You have this idea about the Federalists. We'll talk more, especially those of you in 4A and 4B, about the restricting of free speech. The Federalists, again, remember they have a loose interpretation of the Constitution. They believe that, mob action and that, criticism of the government that leads to kind of disorder and, discord, that those things are not what we want. and that we can expand government agencies, that's okay. Whereas the Democrat Republicans will take a very different approach. They believe in an educated mass, and so they're going to believe in open debate and letting people talk about these things. And you can see here kind of who makes up the differences, and that's pretty clear with the fact that the Democrat Republicans, those workers, those small yeoman farmers, those are going to be the ones that are of most interest to them, whereas the Federalists, these people are going to be led by your merchants, your larger manufacturers, which really don't come into being until we get to after the War of 1812. So that's why I kind of leave them off a little bit, because you don't really have a lot of those, but you certainly have a lot of merchants, and you have your large-scale commercial farmers, right? So your plantation owners, they're going to support the Federalists, even though they're all about agriculture. Right? So you need to understand kind of what we alluded to with this constitutional activity is that the Southern plantation owners have kind of a diverse set of interests that don't always line up with what the small farmers are going to want. And so this is going to be kind of an interesting thing, right? Do we want to have pro-British arrangements, pro-French? Do we want a strong bank? Do we want a weak bank? Do we want more government? Do we want less government? There's some interesting issues that are at play. Now, these things will change and morph over time. The way we're talking about them right now is it's not set in stone. It's not the way it's going to be forever. All right, so George Washington, he's the first president, right? He runs twice. He sets what we call the two-term tradition. Now, after Franklin Roosevelt, that will be put into the Constitution with the 22nd Amendment. But prior to that, it was just a tradition. Most guys said, hey, George Washington only did it twice. I should only do it twice. And so you see him in 1796 essentially stepping down and allowing, John Adams runs for president. It's John Adams' turn, right? And you're going to see that he begins to encourage American neutrality and U.S. and kind of keeping the U.S. from being sucked into what's happening in Europe. And so the XYZ affair is one where this French foreign minister tries to bribe some American diplomats, and the Federalists say, see, look, we can't trust those French. They're a big mess. Look what they're doing to Europe. They've cut off people's heads. They're, doing all this kind of stuff. And so you have John Adams and his envoy essentially being frustrated by France, and that kind of turns the U.S. against France. And so you have him beginning what we call the quasi-war with France, where we start seizing French ships, right? This is kind of quid pro quo, right? France was trying to attack our ships, and because we were trying to be neutral, Britain was attacking our ships. We're going back and forth. We try to send this envoy, and then they get insulted, and we come back, and this leads us to... taking our revenge basically on France in 1796. Now, obviously, this is not going to make Democrat Republicans very, very happy. And so they become very, very critical of what John Adams is doing and the Federalists. And so first off, you've got immigration coming into the country, right? So you've got questions about immigration. Do we want to continue to allow French people to come in? And if they come in, are they bringing radical ideas with them? So you have them trying to limit immigration with the Alien Act, right? You have them passing a Sedition Act limiting criticism of John Adams and his presidency, that we don't want, too much criticism, ruins the American character, it weakens the country, this is bad for business, all this kind of stuff. So you can't make complaints against government officials. And so the Alien and Sedition Acts are meant to silence dissent. They're meant to control the population, either through the immigrant population or by controlling people's expression, self-expression. And so you see that that this really kind of frustrates the Democrat Republicans, and they get very, very critical. And this is where you have the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. James Madison writes the Virginia Resolution. Thomas Jefferson writes the Kentucky Resolution. And what these two resolutions do, they basically do the same thing, but for different states, right? They basically say that states that find that federal law that violates their own state constitutions can, in effect, nullify or at least ignore federal law. And so this is the process of what we call nullification. And the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions for Virginia and Kentucky, it basically allows them to allow pro-French people. They can ignore the Alien Act. They can ignore the Sedition Act because it proposes this idea. John Adams doesn't make it a test case or anything like that. So you've got some states that are not necessarily following the Alien and Sedition Acts. But the key thing about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions is that it's this idea that states can question federal law. And we'll talk later when we get to John C. Calhoun in 1832 about the doctrine of nullification and how that kind of works. So John Adams' presidency will face a great deal of criticism, and you'll see that the Alien and Sedition Acts are wildly unpopular. And so people are very upset. The Federalists are facing a lot of criticism due to their message, and most people feel like this is too much government, that perhaps federalism has gone a little too far with the Alien and Sedition Acts, that, okay, we've got a stable economy, right? We're trying to navigate this whole international situation with France, the French Revolution, and Great Britain. But the quasi-war is hurting business, right? It's creating problems with France, and that's bad. So people don't like the quasi-war. They don't like the impact it has for merchants. They don't like the restriction of rights, and they're concerned about that. So what you're going to see is that you'll have what we call the Revolution of 1800, which is not really a revolution, actually. It's proof that the system works, that the election system can allow for a complete change in leadership and no blood will be spilt. And so basically the Democrat-Republicans, Thomas Jefferson runs as their presidential candidate. He's going to win very handily. John Adams will have to step down. And so we're going to see these opposing factions that really starts over this pro-French, pro-British, banking, Alien and Sedition Act stuff, that this is kind of what we're going to see coming out of this. So the Democrat-Republicans will basically let the Alien and Sedition Acts expire. They don't do anything really ugly. We will see that this is kind of interesting in relation to Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson and Burr were both running for the presidency, right? And they were essentially tied. And so it was the Federalists that got to break the tie between Jefferson and Aaron Burr, who are both Democrat-Republicans. Well, Alexander Hamilton cannot stand Aaron Burr. And I don't remember all the specific details, but it has something to do with the fact that, like, Aaron Burr insulted his father-in-law, and so, like, they had swapped insults multiple times. They hated each other, really did not like each other, had, really kind of had these insults out in public. Everyone knew they didn't like each other. And Aaron Burr is, truthfully, a little bit crazy. He's not the most stable person, which there's a whole nother, like, there's more about Aaron Burr. Like, he ends up, like, he and Alexander Hamilton fight a duel, and he kills Alexander Hamilton. And so then he goes on the run, and then he tries to lead another revolution, and that falls apart. I mean, he's really not the most, like, consistent guy. But in 1800, he was, a reasonable alternative for president as a Democrat-Republican. But Alexander Hamilton hates him so much that he essentially tells the Federalists, look, we can at least trust Jefferson. We can't trust this Burr guy. He's crazy. And, of course, like I said, a lot of this goes back to their personal fights with each other. So what will happen is that Jefferson will win the election of 1800. And so what we're going to see is that many of what's happened in 1800, the question over who would be president, proves that our system works, proves that we can have a complete change in leadership, that we have this expanding nation that requires governmental action, and that we do have this question about dissent. Right? That even though we had a background with the American Revolution of people speaking up and speaking their mind, that doesn't necessarily mean that that dissent is always perfect, right? That the government can sometimes act to restrain dissent. And we certainly will see that as we go throughout U.S. history, how the Supreme Court supports that periodically. And factionalism, political parties begin to emerge very significantly, and they become defined by regional and economic interests. So the American identity that was somewhat vaguely unified in 1790, 1792, is not going to be quite so unified by the time you get to 1800. but it's working, right? And the frontier is a very powerful message. It's a huge promise for the American public, this Western expansion. Of course, it will present a number of different problems. So this is very kind of a quick, in a nutshell view of kind of this lead up to the 1800s, the emergence of political parties, kind of the role of international relations with that. And we'll go into a little more detail with the next lecture when we're talking about how how the United States continues to respond. But I do want to be sure you are familiar with kind of Adams' presidency, the Alien and Sedition Act, his quasi-war, and how all of that kind of plays out. So that is it for lecture number 2, and not too horribly long, I hope. I don't think it was. I haven't seen a timer yet. And there'll be one more after this that will take us all the way through the War of 1812.